Out of all the clutch plays that went towards beating the Amphisbaena, the MVP was definitely Haruhime. You may not think so with only the stuff we saw in the anime, but when you realize what she did after saving Lily and Cassandra, you'll come to see this final spell was actually the product of years and years of experience. A feat accomplished through sheer determination and willpower that even the most skilled mages could only hope to carry out. So, as we look at that, some cut flashbacks and Cassandra's turning point, we'll get to see just how far some of DanMachi's most important characters have come. Let's get started. Episode 14. Daphne Laros, covering the rest of Chapter 7 from Volume 14 of the light novel. Jumping right back into the imminent danger Ryuu was facing, and the 5 minutes she said would be enough for Belle to recover was in actuality the bare minimum of what was required. You see, because she didn't want Belle to worry more than was needed, Ryuu deemed it necessary to lie in order to get him to accept what she was saying. That may have put them into a very risky situation, but Ryuu was more than ready to sacrifice herself in order to ensure Belle got the rest he needed. It was the only way at least one of them could possibly escape the dungeon here. Now, the constant enemy Ryuu was currently fighting was the pitch-black darkness that consumed more than just her surroundings. It was an overwhelming shade that chipped away at her very core. A spreading corruption that destroyed personalities and destabilized information. So, as this darkness added more and more anxiety to her situation, the very concept of time began to distort into what seemed like an eternity. The 300 seconds Ryuu felt had passed 10 times over was in reality nothing more than 30 seconds. And because she no longer had Belle to talk to, the intrusive thoughts she had been trying so hard to ignore were now the only thing she could possibly think of. They were fearsome imaginations that doubted every prospect of survivability. It was only after she looked at Belle to check up on him that she was finally able to set those aside and think about him. Specifically of just how amazing he was with how he was handling all this. Sure, he may have been close to falling into a frenzy, but any other adventurer stuck in this situation would likely have taken their own life already. So to her, Belle was handling both the despair and fatigue exceptionally. Now, an interesting thing about Belle's assistance during the fight was that it had gone to highlight his mastery of a crucial adventurer skill. You see, not only had Belle been subconsciously keeping track of when 5 minutes was up, but he was also extremely wary of his surroundings. The entire time he'd been asleep, a part of him was also sensing for danger like some sort of natural instinct. It was an impressive ability that Ryuu was surprised to see Belle have mastered so quickly, likely due to the prowess of the person who trained him. If we switch back to the Amphisbaena fight now, while the rest of the battle skipped over very little, there were a few missing flashbacks which contextualized certain abilities. Like, take for example Ouka's Koku swing. This wasn't an ability he just naturally possessed, but was instead an attack he developed over time through countless hours training with Tagemakazuchi. By itself it wasn't enough to pierce the dragon's durable scales, but with the right breathing and some help from Mikoto's gravity magic, Ouka was able to channel every ounce of his body's strength. His god had helped him develop a technique which used every bit of his huge form's potential. The key factor which made this move a success, though, was neither his attack nor Mikoto's gravity magic, but instead Welf's activation of Hio. This had caused the dragon to use a lot of its crimson mist prematurely. So, without Ouka having spotted Mikoto's magic being cast in the water, his command to Welf would never have been given, and the dragon would likely have negated her magic before it could even take effect. It was a clever series of moves that all stemmed from Ouka's incredible perception. When it was time for Haruhime to shine next, the way she survived was much less elegant than what we saw in the anime. She wasn't just standing in the open flames like they weren't even there, but instead had kept herself covered with the Goliath robe the entire time. In fact, had the anime really been faithful to this scene in the novels, then Haruhime would have remained face down to the ground since that's the way she managed to keep herself safe. It was after she had pushed Cassandra and Lily out of the way that she immediately threw the robe over her body, then dove face down to protect herself from the napalm. There wasn't a single part of her body exposed to the raging flames above her. Now, to us that may not seem like that big of a deal, but as a caster who didn't know how to fight at all, this was the first and only tactical move she'd ever executed. She had reacted to a situation and instinctively saved both herself and her party members. Now, just because the Goliath rope prevented her from getting burnt, didn't mean she couldn't feel anything. The heat that now surrounded her was just unbearable. It melted away her very consciousness, all while scorching the inside of her throat. But even with such intense pain eating away at her, none of it was enough to break her resolve and prevent her from doing what was necessary. Even if she did burn and turn to ash, nothing would stop her from completing the chance her party needed her to. So, as the napalm continued to swarm all around her, Haruhime sat herself cross-legged under the rope, then used all her mental strength to finish the song to completion. This was, after all, the only job ever required of her. Haruhime couldn't quite remember when it was, but it was several years ago that Aisha herself had said all she needed to do was sing. You see, numerous times she'd been taken to the deep levels, and each time that was the only thing expected from her. She was stuffed securely into a sturdy basket, kept far from the dangers of any battle, then only taken out when a chant was needed. She was essentially treated like a precious item, good for a single purpose and nothing else. So, as she acted the way she was treated, Haruhime would continue her chants regardless of what was happening. Her mind could be tattered from the sight of Amazons getting massacred, but she would always continue singing no matter how gruesome it got. Feelings weren't a necessary part of the job she was given. Finish a chant even 1 second late and that would just mean the death of another Amazon. These were the words that haunted her every time she went down to the dungeon with them. It was their fate that relied heavily on her ability to boost them. Their lives that rested in the mysterious power she'd been given. So, with this innocent girl being held responsible for the lives of others, it was only natural the more Amazons she lost, the more of a nightmare things became. This girl who knew nothing of violence or the cruelty of battle was forced to witness her own familia get slaughtered over and over again. Then, when even their captain friend would return bloodied from battle, all of that loss and all that injury would be directed at Haruhime and blamed solely on her. She was made to believe that it was her lack of ability that was the direct cause of everything lost. That being the case, Haruhime had grown to hate everything about it. The dungeon, the violence, and even the people were all things she despised from the bottom of her heart. But even with Aisha telling her it was okay to let them die, Haruhime knew that she could never do that. She had neither the resolve nor strength to stand up to the heavy pressure of the life placed in front of her. It would have been easy to just stop chanting and let them succumb to the monsters they were fighting, but Haruhime didn't want anyone to die. If there were ever people struggling on the battlefield in front of her, then Haruhime committed to doing all she could to save them. Not because she was told it was necessary, but instead because it's what she wanted. So, with a pledge to save everyone she could, Haruhime would sing day after day without hesitation. She would cast her magic over and over and always ensure those who needed it received it. It was a long, arduous history of experience which culminated in the single chant she was making here. What made this one so particularly special wasn't just the mental fortitude needed to ignore the fire, but also its accelerated nature stemming from years of experience. After chanting this spell thousands of times over, Haruhime had reached a pinnacle of magic basics. She had achieved mastery over a feat known as accelerated casting. You see, because her previous environment required her magic as fast as possible, this was the one real skill she had managed to cultivate. She understood a single second could save lives and even achieve victory, so over time she had polished the one and only ability that belonged to her, much to the point that it now surpassed even upper-class magicians. It may not seem like much given Belle's constant use of Swift Strike magic, but this accelerated casting is truly a remarkable feat even the most renowned spellcasters struggle to obtain. It's the mark of years of training and repetition, something only a person specializing in casting can obtain. So, since casting was the only thing she was good for, Haruhime had staked everything on becoming the fastest caster in the world. If that meant her spell would reach the people that it needed to, then Haruhime was willing to place both her body and soul on the line for it. Normally she would prioritize safety to prevent an ignis fatuus, but in situations like this, speed was everything. So, as her song echoed to completion across the Crystal Cavern, Haruhime gifted Aisha the power needed to finish the boss fight. Now, even with the dragon having been defeated, Haruhime was still surrounded by an unending sea of flames. She was still subjected to the tormenting heat even while under the safety of the Goliath robe. So, as she lay face down awaiting rescue, Aisha had used the potion to carve out a path to her, immediately hugging her despite the robe still being hot enough to burn her arms. A rather important thing to note about the dialogue here is that what Aisha said wasn't "you're all grown up," but instead the sentence "you've mastered it." A vastly different statement which refers to her mastery of accelerated casting. It's the acknowledgement of all the trials and tribulations Haruhime's had to go through until now. I don't know why the anime decided not to show it, but this whole skill mastery really does highlight her growth a lot. It's one of the more significant bits of cut content that develop both her and Aisha's character. Specifically how she was able to overcome her dreadful past and even use it to help out here. Now, after the dungeon had started collapsing, the only route out was upward. It was a climb that even a first tier adventurer would struggle with. So, even with the branch dome being there to make things easier, the fact they had several injured to carry made their chances of survival 50-50. There was no avoiding the inevitable climb up the cliff's steep rock face. Add in the crystals that were falling from the ceiling above, and you can probably understand why success was only at 50%. When Lily had suggested going down instead, the resulting choice was split right down the middle. It was a stalemate in which the deciding vote was left up to Daphne. You see, whenever a party was in an impasse such as this, the majority vote was almost always the deciding factor. So if she was to vote and choose to retreat, then that would be the option everyone would have to go with. That being the case, because Daphne didn't know Belle the same way Welfer Lily did, it was only natural for her to stray towards the side of retreating. A fairly straightforward decision until Cassandra had stepped in. While everyone else was fighting amongst themselves, Cassandra had thought long and hard about what her prophecy meant. She'd thoroughly examined the 17 lines that had been burdening her heart the entire time. We already know how she figured out to go east, but there was a whole step before in which she realized this wasn't actually the place where she'd die. The 14th line, which when re-examined, doesn't refer to imminent death like how she thought it did. Yes, the coffin is a symbol of death, but if it's actively tormenting her within the cage of despair, then that meant it was only a warning. It warned that death wasn't inevitable unless they made the wrong decision after being tormented. So, if you consider what it is that was actively tormenting her, it couldn't be the boss since that was already defeated, and it couldn't be despair since that was tormenting her before. No. What was tormenting her right now was the decision itself. The very decision of remaining or retreating was the mentioned torment which would turn the cage into a coffin if made incorrectly. So, after understanding where she was in her prophecy, that made deciphering the next lines all the more important, eventually leading her to the conclusion that going east was the answer. Initially she was confused due to thinking the sun was a reference to Apollo, but when you apply the line to this exact situation, the whole thing just makes a lot more sense. Now, after Daphne had gone to reject even this, we were given yet another lengthy monologue depicting the despair Cassandra was going through. But rather than end it by drowning in sorrow like how she usually did, she instead looked deeper into herself and fought against it. Even if it was Daphne who was always breaking her heart, she was also the one who would always be there to pick her back up. She was the one who told her to fight against despair and look to the future. The one who encouraged her to stand up and keep going forward. So, even though this curse was actively trying to rip them apart, Cassandra refused to give in to the weak part of her that was terrified of rejection, leading her to make the bold actions we saw in the anime. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this week's episode. If you want a sneak peek of what was cut from next week's episode, then you can check out my stream every Sunday talking about it. We do giveaways, open card packs, and play video games sometimes. So the link to that will be down below in the description. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!